our studies, we've come now to this critical part in Gideon's development. We've watched Gideon being taken on a historical journey lesson by God to be inspired by those that had gone before so that they might overcome their enemies. And we saw it started with an understanding of Abraham building and choosing God in the land against the Canaanites. It was involved Jacob, who buried his idols at the oak of Shechem, and the covenant and the stone of witness that Joshua had established to sign an ordinance and a covenant with the nation to choose to serve God and to flee idolatry. And we saw that Gideon was going to be taught that he needed to focus on those moments to get courage and to be encouraged and to be strengthened, that God would save them from their enemies and from the bondage of Egypt. And so Gideon was going to be called, as we saw Moses, Mark 2, to deliver them out of Egypt. But to understand that, he needed to first offer a Passover, as we've seen, and then to complete the leaven purge of his father's household and to get rid of the idolatry that was in his backyard, that God might release the nation from bondage. And instead to replace the worship that there was on Yahweh's altar built on top of that stone of witness as opposition against all of the idolatrous practices that the nation had endured thus far. And so Gideon, instead of causing his family to turn against him, is inspiring them to stand up and to fight for the cause, and that his father changes his name to show him that he was a living witness to the fact that Baal didn't exist. Jerubbaal, let Baal plead, as long as Gideon was alive, it was evidence and proof to the entire nation that Baal was a useless figment of their imagination that had nothing to do with worship. And so Joash protects his son and gets him behind him and yokes himself together with him as Baal's contender to bring the nation back to the true worship of Yahweh Elohim of their fathers. And just as it was, as we saw, every year when they had sowed, at the time of harvest, they would all come. The Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east would all come. And so we pick up the story now in Judges chapter 6 and verse 33. Then, says the record, all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east were gathered together and went over and pitched in the Jezreel Valley. And every year, this time of year, the Midians would invade, and they came through and began their purge of the land. A purge for any form of food that they had grown. The potential for becoming even more destitute and even more devastated is about to unfold. And it's happening in the fertile Jezreel Valley, the richest and most productive of all of Israel's growing food regions in the entire land. Jezreel means God sows. Jezreel means God sows. It was so plentiful in that place, they could see that God would bless it, and the Midianites are about to come, but not this time, brothers and sisters. God had sown, but not so much in his land, but in the heart of a mighty man of valor who saw the land of his inheritance once again about to be overrun by his enemies, is now going to be motivated to stand up. Now was the time to restore the rightful inheritance back to his people. It was a time for action. And so it says, verse 34, the Spirit of Yahweh came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered after him. The Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he blew a trumpet. So what is this Spirit of Yahweh? You see, it's not probably some inner involuntary reaction that was occurring inside of Gideon's brain. Yeah, so it's also mentioned, this idea of the Spirit of Yahweh coming upon people was mentioned a number of times through Scripture, of faithful men and women who were motivated to act by God. So Jephthah in Judges chapter 11 verse 29 was motivated for war. So was Samson in Judges chapter 13 verse 25. Saul, who became the king of Israel in 1 Samuel 10, was motivated to prophesy. And Elijah, there are plenty of men and women through the Bible where it says the Spirit of Yahweh came upon them. So what was that? Well, the answer is that the Spirit of Yahweh coming upon someone is a description of their understood experiences about what's happening around them, and an emotional response that was built by faithful men and women to take action for God, for spiritual reasons, to accomplish God's will. That's what it was. Gideon could see the Midianites invading the land, about to just devastate it once again. And he is motivated to respond to God and to try and set up a rebellion against the Midianites. They felt compelled to respond for God and to his purpose. I want you to notice that this is not just some passing feeling or glimpse or some spasm that's occurring inside them, because the word for coming upon them in the Hebrew means to clothe them. The Spirit of Yahweh coming upon them wasn't just some random involving spasm. It means to clothe. It's the word that means to put on a garment. And so Gideon is growing in faith in his understanding of his role and his responsibility as that mighty warrior. Gideon is now the feller of idolatry, the hewer down of idolatry, and now he's understood that he needs to transition from the idols that he's destroyed to now destroy the enemy. God, he's realizing, had called him to lead an army against these enemies, and he sees God's inheritance once more about to become overrun, and he's motivated to fulfill his ministry as the savior of God's people. And so he stands up. The Spirit of Yahweh clothes him, and as a mighty warrior, he puts on the armor that's required now, as God had given him, the armor of faith and confidence that God would be with him. And what does he do? Well, it says in verse 34, the Spirit of Yahweh come upon him, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered unto him. The family of Gideon and his father all come unto him. It's his brethren. It's his father's family, his brethren, the very men that Gideon was afraid of, upsetting at the first, now come and stand shoulder to shoulder to be with Gideon to overcome their enemies. And Gideon uses his family to then send out messengers, verse 35. He sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and who also were gathered after him. And he sent messages unto Asher, and unto Zebulun, unto Naphtali, and they all come up to meet him. Gideon uses all his family to bring them all to help him. But why blow a trumpet? This is interesting. Why blow a trumpet? Sure, it's a way of recognizing things, but why the blowing of the trumpet? Well, it's interesting. It's the blowing of the ram's horn. And the Lord taught that so you would blow the trumpet for two key reasons. The first reason was to call for the assembly to gather themselves together. That's the very first reason, according to Numbers 10, that you would call them to come. Numbers 10, and the other reason was to sound an alarm. All right, so first to call an assembly or to sound an alarm. And Numbers 10 says, verse 9, if ye go to war in your land against the enemy that oppresses you, then ye shall blow an alarm with the trumpets, and ye shall be remembered before Yahweh your God, and ye shall be saved from your enemies. Now you imagine that. This is Gideon standing up after 7 years of oppression. And he grabs that ram's horn. And in blowing that ram's horn, he is calling the nation to respond. But more than that, isn't he? Because not only is he blowing the horn to try and get everybody to come, but he's blowing the horn that Yahweh might remember his covenant, that Yahweh would be with his people. He was calling the nation together and asking God to support them in their activities, to restore the land of their inheritance once more. And as family come, and they send out messages, and they all come after him. Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali. Who were these tribes? Well, they're the tribes that were in the immediate vicinity around them. But they had a 40-year-old memory. You see, they all came as the same group of tribes who had responded in Judges chapter 5, verses 14 to 19. Zebulun and Naphtali, supported by Ephraim, had supported Barak to take out Sisera and Jabin, king of Canaan. These guys had done this before, 40 years before. And these tribes now come. Interestingly enough, we don't have time to spend on this, but Asher is a tribe that didn't come, according to Barak's time, in Deborah's song in Judges chapter 5. But this time they come. This time they've learned from their mistake, and they're there to support Gideon and the family to overcome their enemies. And so they all come to meet Gideon and to now listen to what Gideon has to say, as he's now about to lead them in this uprising against their oppressors. And while Gideon is waiting to have those who are coming, he's grappling. He's grappling with an issue. He's grappling with an issue that he still needs support from God for by way of another sign. What's he grappling with? Well, it says, Gideon says unto God, if that will save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece on the wall. I need a sign, God. And he's grappling. What is he grappling with? Does Gideon seek a further sign from God because he's having doubts? Or is he seeking a further sign because he's having second thoughts on his responsibilities? Well, nothing would indicate that that's the case. So why is he seeking further signs and evidence from God? Well, think about it this way. Gideon prefaces his question for a sign with a key statement, a key question. If thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said. He finishes, by the way, exactly the same way. I'll put the fleece on the ground, and therefore I shall know that thou wilt save, verse 37, thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said. So the whole envelope of that story, or the first message of his sign, was asking God for confidence that he would save Israel by his hand. But God had already told him that. God had already said that he would be with him. Why is he asking for a sign? Well, you see, I don't believe Gideon is doubting as such. I think Gideon was asking for God's approval. That was it now the time to fulfill his mission? Was it now? Wilt thou save Israel by mine hand now? Will you be with me now, God? Is it now that we're supposed to do this? Is now the appointed time to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Midianites? Gideon wasn't and didn't want to be presumptuous. I need to know that you will be with me and that this is the time that you want me to go. And so he puts out a fleece. And the fleece is interesting. So he puts the fleece of wool in the floor. I'm going to put a fleece on the ground, and it will be, if there be dew on this fleece only, and it be dry all over the earth, then I shall know that thou wilt save Israel by mine hand. And so in the story, I believe Gideon is suggesting that he's going to be the fleece, that this is going to be by my hand. And the dew, when you go through Scripture, the dew of the morning is known, or is very much a symbol of Yahweh's blessings upon a dry desert place. Genesis 27:23 and Deuteronomy 33 all talk about the blessings that God would do ascending like the dew. And the dry land that's around him was what? All the ground around him, all the earth beside him. All the ground, verse 39, is going to represent the rest of the nation. That's the land without God's blessing. So I want to put a fleece on the ground, and I want to know that if now's the time that we take them out, I need that fleece to be full of water, I need everywhere else to still be dry. And I think the point of the first sign, brothers and sisters and young people, was that Gideon was seeking to ensure that God's blessings would be with him if he went into battle today. Are you going to be with me? Is now the time to move. And look at how emphatically Yahweh answers that request. Verse 38 says, and it was so. For he rose up early on the morrow, and he thrust the fleece together, and wringed the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. You can't miss that, can you, brothers and sisters? A bowl full of water. As he got up in the morning and he wrung that fleece out to see how much God had answered him, he had this bowl overflowing with water. That's how much God would be with him. That's an excessive amount of dew. And the point is that God would totally support Gideon. As such, he was filled and overflowing the brim. But Gideon's got more than that as a question. Gideon had just blown a trumpet, and all these men had gathered in to join him in the fight, right? And he's got a question. What's his question? Well, the question is, would God be with them in the same way as he would be with Gideon? He'd say, I will be with you. By your hand, Gideon, I'm going to deliver these men. Gideon says, okay, well, now that I know you're going to be with me, what I actually need to know is, will this water transfer from the fleece to the ground? How's that going to happen? Will you be with them in the same way as you are with me? See, Gideon had been inspired by God through the work he had done and the signs that he'd been shown. But would God's blessing pass onto these men in the same way? Would God's blessing be transferred to be upon them? You see, the key expression of the first sign was by my hand. By my hand. Well, that's if thou will save Israel, by my hand. That's not the second sign. The second sign was all the ground had to be full of dew. This is why Gideon felt he had to ask God for another sign. It wasn't the fact that he was still unsure of the first sign. It was the fact that he needed to understand how God would transfer that water. Let me prove, he says, I pray thee, but this once. Let it be dry only on the fleece, but upon all the ground. Let there be dew. And look at how God responds. Look at how God responds. The bowl full of water is transferred in such a way that there was dew everywhere, and yet the fleece was dry. And you know, there's another wonderful thing. There's a wonderful thing in the way God works with Gideon in this moment. Because Gideon had said, notice what it says. Gideon had said that I want proof that all the men that were with him. Let me prove, I pray thee, but this once. Let me prove. Do you know what the word for proving means? The word to prove means to try by smell. All right? To try by smell. It's the idea of the quivering of the nostrils when you smell something. The sniff test. All right? We all know the sniff test. Don't need to tell you any more about that. So, the sniff test is what God wants to say. I just need to know that this is going to pass muster. And the men's offering was going to be too rich for God. The number of men, all the ground was going to be too rich for God. Because, do you know what's interesting? Because that word to prove, I pray thee, says Gideon. In Judges chapter 6, verse 39, God's going to say, no, Gideon, this is not going to be about you. This is not about you proving anyone. I will try. Because you know what God says? Whilst Gideon wanted to prove with the fleece, God is going to prove the men by water that Gideon would have to take. Because he's going to bring them down, says Judges chapter 7, verse 4. Bring the men down. The people that are with you are too many. Bring them down under the water, and I will try them. That's the same Hebrew word. If you grab colouring in pencil, link those two words. Gideon says, let me prove thee, I pray thee this once. Judges 6, verse 39, draw a line all the way down. Judges chapter 7, verse 4. Gideon is going to be taught. You don't have to worry about how that water's going to transfer. I'll show you. I'll show you exactly how it's going to work. I will show you how much dry land you actually need to go with you. What, you can have all the dry land, Gideon. If you understand how powerful I am, then I'll show you what it means when I said I will be with thee. I'll show you. You come with me. And so whilst Gideon needed reassurance that God would go with him, along with the men that were there, God was going to show Gideon just how he could do and how he would do everything for Gideon's request, but with only just a handful of the men that would be required. And perhaps now we can understand that this little trickle of dew would develop into a mighty flood as God was going to work to save his people and restore his inheritance. And this is perhaps why he's called Jerubbaal now in this story. Judges chapter 7, verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, who is called Gideon, all the people that were with him. You can't, if you get a colouring in pencil, when you colour in all the ground, verse 39, all the ground, verse 40, and all the people that were with him, Judges chapter 7, verse 1. You can't miss the connections, can you? All the people, all the ground. You see, God was going to show Gideon that he only needed a handful. And Gideon's actions destroying Baal had inspired this family and inspired the nation, spread further throughout the tribes, that men had all come motivated by Gideon's witness and proof that Baal and idolatry was nothing and that Yahweh would restore his people, and they looked to Gideon to take the lead. And God's going to show Gideon just what's required. You know where they come? Well, this is remarkable, brothers and sisters. They come and they rose up early and they pitched beside the well of Harod, so that the host of the Midianites were on one side and the hill of Moreh, by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The well of Harod beside the hill of Moreh. Do you know, this is remarkable. Well, I thought this when I looked at it. Look at this. The hill of Moreh. Why are we given the detail as to where they are? Why the well of Harod, which we'll talk in a minute, and why the hill of Moreh? Why are we given all the detail? Do you know, the word Moreh is very interesting in the context of the Jew. So, the root word of this word for Moreh means to shoot forth or to teach. And the root of this word is the idea of the way in which the Jew would saturate the ground. You see, this word, or particularly the root word for this word Moreh, or it's pronounced exactly the same way, is used specifically in the respect of the early rains that would come on the nation of Israel. We've all heard about the latter rains. Well, there was an early rain that would come, and the early rain would come at the very end of summer, and at the very end of the harsh drought of summer, and it would soften the ground so that it was ready to receive seed. The Moreh would come and would shoot forth the land at the very end of a dry summer, bringing much needed relief, and would herald the time for planting that would occur. That's what the word Moreh means. And it's Moses' song that links these two. The idea of shooting forth or to teach, which is the idea of refreshing learnings, is brought together by Moses in Deuteronomy 32. The idea of to shoot forth or to teach, he links these ideas and he says, "Give ear, O heavens, and speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. My doctrine shall drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, as the small rain upon the tender herb, in the showers upon the grass, because I will publish the name of Yahweh and ascribe ye greatness unto our God." This idea of the dew or the rain here is the idea of the Moreh. And they would come now to this very spot, the very hill that caught the early rains, to herald a witness that the drought of summer was finished. The desert conditions of the Midianite oppression is about to be vanished. The rain is about to come. The transfer of that water is about to come, and the whole land is about to shoot forth as a witness that God would be with them. But there's a problem. There's a problem. There's too many men. There were too many men, and there were plenty of them who were afraid. You see, their courage and faith still had to grow like Gideon's. Perhaps now that's why we're told where they were. They were at the well of Harod. The well of Harod? It's the well of trembling. the well of trembling. The water that sprung from this well would bubble up, constantly being disturbed and constantly bubbling forth, that the water looked like it was totally troubled and anxious. A very apt description of the majority of his men. But God was going to prove to Gideon that even men like this, so long as they trusted Yahweh, could possibly be pulled into the battle. But they had to have a specific attitude. God is now going to prove to Gideon who the men would be that would transform them, that he would serve them. Verse 2 says, Yahweh says unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for thee, for me, to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand has saved me. Gideon, we've got to be careful with this expression, mine own hand. If you link those expressions, if you'll save Israel by mine hand, verse 36, but if you'll save Israel by my hand, verse 37, God says, we've got to be careful with that expression. Judges chapter 7, verse 2, mine own hand has saved me could mean that they think that they can save themselves. It's not going to be the case. I want to show you that, Gideon. The people that are with thee are too many for me, says God, to give the Midianites into their hands. Lest Israel glorify or vaunt or boast themselves against me, saying, mine own hand has saved me. God needed this victory to be without question his victory. Gideon himself is going to have to fully learn this lesson. Mine hand, says God. No. You're going to save Israel from the hand of the enemies. No one's going to say, 7 verse 2, that mine hand hath saved me. And by 300 men will I save you, says God in Judges chapter 7 verse 7. I'm going to save you out of the hands of the Philistines, out of the hands of the Midianites with these 300 men. This is not about you in your hand. This is about you understanding that I'm going to save you with these men. And God's going to now train Gideon what spirit and attitude would be needed. What sort of people was he going to work with? And how was that going to do it? Yahweh hath delivered into your hand. Gideon's going to transfer in his whole brain, brothers and sisters and young people, from saying, mine hand is going to deal with this. You look at what he says in verse 15 of Judges chapter 7. What does he say at the end of all of this story when he finally goes into battle? And it was so, says Judges 7 verse 15. When Gideon heard the telling of this dream and the interpretation, he worshipped and returned to the host of Israel and said, arise, for Yahweh hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian. Oh, that's a shift for Gideon, isn't it? Mine hand. God's delivered him into your hand. See, Gideon's going to lead and grow his people in an understanding that it wasn't just about him, that actually God would work with some people and bring about a victory. And the process of whittling Gideon's armies down, brothers and sisters, was going to be the way in which God would teach Gideon how he would work and how the dew of heaven would be transferred. And we'll see, just like Gideon, these 300 men, although fearful in their own way, had enough courage and trust in God and not in themselves, that God was prepared to work with them to deliver his people. He was looking for a specific attitude. So who were the ones that he wasn't going to work with and why, brothers and sisters? Well, here's your three groups of men, you see. There was going to be 32,000 men who were going to come. God says, we can't have this many. This is going to be a problem. Now, therefore, he says, go to verse 3, and proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is afraid and fearful, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. Whoever wants to go home, if they're scared, can leave now. You can imagine Gideon, can't you? Yep, whoever wants to go home can leave. 2/3 of his army walk off. Hey, 2/3. 2/3 disappeared. First group was sent home, were those that had responded, motivated to come and to fight, but only because others were going. They had every intention to fight. When they came to the battlefield, oh, that's a bit of a big army. When they came and saw the Midianite hordes, they had no real conviction or belief in God's ability to save them. In fact, the opposite was true. They were utterly afraid. 2/3 of the army fell into this category. 22,000 of his 32,000 men. Gideon must have been sitting there blowing his trumpet going, woohoo, look at how many people we've got. This is going to be great, even though the odds are still stacked against us. We've got such a good army. Out the door. Do you know what he does? Do you know what God does with Gideon? God takes Gideon back to the law. I think this is a helpful lesson for all of us here. God takes Gideon back to the door to teach the first lesson for what he had to learn. Why did they have to go home, brothers and sisters? Why? Well, do you know, here's the law. Look what it says. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 3. Hopefully you can read that on the screen without needing to turn it up. Deuteronomy 20, verse 3. So the priest would come, and when they were about to go into the battle, the priest would proclaim in the ears of all the people, Deuteronomy 20, verse 3, let not your hearts faint, fear not, do not tremble, neither be terrified because of them. For Yahweh your God is he that goeth with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. That's what the priest would say first. He'd come in and he'd say, don't be upset, don't be afraid, right? God's going to fight for you. Don't panic. He's going to go across and is going to save you from the enemies. Now, says the law, there are a number of people we want to go home. The first of those are if you've built a new house and haven't moved into it, then you can go out. The second group, if you've planted a vineyard and haven't eaten the fruit, you can leave too, because that's just not fair. If you die and you haven't been able to eat your own fruit of your vineyard, that's just not on. And if you're engaged but you're not yet married, you can go home too, because you need to get sorted out and get that married and enjoy the comfort and the beauty of marriage. That's your responsibility. And the last group, says the priest, Deuteronomy 20 verse 8, the officer shall speak further unto the people and say, what man is there, even with all of that is still fearful and faint-hearted? There's exactly the same Hebrew words here. Whoever is fearful and afraid. Deuteronomy 20 verse 8. Who is fearful and faint-hearted? If you need to go home right now, let him go and return to his house. Why? Or the record tells us why in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Lest his brethren's heart faint as well as his heart. You see, these people were had not only come because it was the right thing to do, but they'd come but without a real conviction that God would fight and save them. Therefore, they were faint-hearted and fearful. These people were dangerous in battle. Fear is contagious. It's like an infection. When faith evaporates, it's a disaster. You ask Peter, when you're in the middle of the war, what happens if you lose faith? Israelites on the borders of the Red Sea fainted in the same way. We can feel like this too at times. Faint and fearful. 2/3 of the army evaporated and disappeared into the ether of the Jezreel Valley to go home because they were afraid. Do you know, brothers and sisters, the law never condemned those people. Do you know why? Because sometimes in life, that can get on top of us. Can't it? 22,000 men, we can be just like them. When faith in our God is lacking and we sometimes doubt whether God even exists, whether the truth is even right, we need to take time aside at home to get it right in terms of our perspective. We've got to get these feelings in the right place. We've got to learn to trust God again. There are times of great stress, pressure and depression, brothers and sisters. The law never condemned these 22,000. And neither should we. Faith is something that requires regular and constant attention that waxes and wanes due to the external pressures that surround us, that can affect our focus and trust in Almighty God. They're never condemned by God. Why not? And the answer was, they are sent home in order to learn and to reconsider the law. And when they saw their brethren come home, then they could see in practice just what God had meant, that he would go and that he would fight for them. Their evidence was seen by the faithful return of their brethren. And that's exactly what happens here in the battle. They turn up immediately after. So Gideon puts these men, or Gideon and the 300 men surround the army, and all of a sudden they start fleeing. And it says, the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh, verse 23, and pursued after the Midianites, verse 23. It's exactly what happens. Their faith came back. The 22,000 come streaming back into battle when they see God at work. There's lessons for us sometimes, isn't there, brothers and sisters, in this. You see, how we handle, if we're non-fearful, brothers and sisters, how we handle fearful people in these moments will determine whether they come back at all. If people need time and space and the comfort away from the pressures that they're facing to get perspective in life. God didn't judge or condemn these people, and neither should we. Gentle encouragement, allowing them to learn and to grow in time, will see God work in their life to teach and inspire them as well. Treat them lovingly and caringly, and we may just win them back for God. And if we are fearful, brothers and sisters and young people, it's actually okay to have times of challenge and crisis. It's natural that sometimes as we fight against our nature, we sometimes doubt. It's how we deal with this that's the key. We need to seek perspective in time of peace to understand how the battle's going to work. Taking time aside and finding peace to allow our times to stand still will allow us to see the salvation of God. It's actually okay to struggle. It's actually perhaps okay to not even fully understand everything. But it's never okay to give up. God wanted us all to learn and to grow together, and he allowed those that were fearful the time away from the battlefield to learn and to gain that courage and faith to come back. And God sent those 22,000 men from the battlefield to teach Gideon that lesson. But there was still too many for God. There were still too many for God. There was another attitude that had to be removed. And it's another learning curve for Gideon. 10,000 men was still too many. He'd already shown that he could save with 10,000 men. That was the story of Barak in Judges chapter 4 and 5. This time, he was going to do it with much less. And so he says, verse 4, Yahweh says unto Gideon, the people are yet too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that of whom I will say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And whoso I say won't go him, this same shall not go at all. What was the second group? So the second group were a group who was self-assured and overconfident. You see, this group would trust in themselves. God brings Gideon's remaining army to the water and picks the very group that Gideon would never have chosen to save Israel. He saves Israel with 300 men. Gideon would have chosen the 9,700 men all day, wouldn't he? God says, no, not for them. That's not who we're going to have. These 300 men that he's going to choose would never have been Gideon's choice. God was going to prove to Gideon how he could make a fleece full of water and the rest of the ground dry, and now he would prove the opposite. He didn't need the dew all over the ground. In fact, a handful of men with a very keen spirit, that would be the ones that he would choose. They were not the natural warriors. They were not the gallant and brave. They were not the self-confident ones, brothers and sisters. Instead, he was going to work with the humble and contrite ones who trembled at God's word. Those are the ones that would put their trust in God and not in themselves. God points out those he'd win the war with by how they were drinking the water. And as Gideon watched the group, he brought them down, verse 5, to the water, the people to the water, and it says that Yahweh said unto Gideon, everyone that laps of the water with his tongue as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise everyone that boweth down upon his knees to drink. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, for 300 men, but all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink. As Gideon watched, he could see two very distinct groups. The vast majority of the rest of the 10,000 were on their knees, their noses buried in the water, their faces fully immersed to get a good long drink. But scattered amongst those men was a second group, a handful of men who nervously and warily were standing there, not with their faces buried, but were bringing the water up to their mouth, drinking constantly, checking their surroundings, making sure they were still safe, just watching for danger. If you ever watch a dog drink, they drink at 1,000,000 miles an hour, right? And they drink ready to run at any time. They're always wary in case of danger. And they remain on their feet at all times. You've never seen a dog sitting down drinking, unless he's dying. This is the attitude of these men. They were on their feet, checking the surroundings. They weren't entirely cocky or confident. The others, self-assured and confident in their ability, were bowed on their knees, fully secure by their own confidence and their own abilities. They were too cocky, too comfortable, too confident. And the same risk for the fearful group remained for God in the second group. This group was self-confident that their victory would be won by their own might and their own prowess. Not who we can. We can't have this group. Instead, God chooses the ones that Gideon naturally wouldn't have chosen. There's a couple of lessons for us in this. The first lesson is how we choose people to serve for God. I'll go back to the slide, they're slightly out of order. How we choose people for God. I think, brothers and sisters, too often in ecclesial life, we end up looking for people who are best suited to the jobs because they have a natural talent or a personal strength. But perhaps, brothers and sisters, what we're being taught by God in the story of Gideon here is that actually we need to primarily be considering people, more importantly, by their attitude, not their aptitude. You see, Samuel the prophet learnt when looking at David's brethren that God looks not as man seeth, because he looks on the heart. Perhaps the lesson is that natural talent is not always the best way to get the best outcomes for God. It sometimes can be incredibly detrimental because it boosts pride and self-importance rather than God's glory. We need to see that God's glory is first developed when we see the attitude that God desperately wants to see first. And we need to perhaps trade efficiency or getting the job done as quickly as possible with actually job effectiveness, getting the job done to get the best outcome for God. It may not look as pretty. It might not go as smoothly. However, we know from the scriptures that those offerings with the right attitude are so much more acceptable to God, aren't they? So perhaps we need to start looking more for attitude first and aptitude second. And the second lesson that comes from this for us is whilst we might not be fearful, we might also be overconfident sometimes. Feeling too cocky in the truth. One of the issues in life when everything's going well and life's not too stressful, we can start to trust too much in our own abilities. And, perhaps that can happen more readily in senior years too. We become less worried about some of the issues that we might have to face. We've got other issues to deal with, but definitely not some of the challenges that young families might face. And many kings of Israel and Judah experienced significant issues because of their attitude of self-reliance at the end of their life, more than the beginning. Many faithful fell prey to the issue of self-confidence. Solomon, Hezekiah, Josiah, Asa. You think of all of the faithful kings of Judah. Tell me which ones didn't have a struggle at the end. The warning from the Gideon himself in the story falls prey to his own self-confidence in the mistakes that he makes with the ephod. There's lessons for us in this, isn't there? The warning is clear. Wherefore, says Paul in Corinthians, whoever thinketh he standeth, take heed lest he fall. We've always got to remember that God looks unto him that is of a poor and contrite spirit, that trembles at God's word, is fearful about God's word. And God singles out these two men, the fearful and afraid, and the overly self-confident and self-assured, and says, both of you are not going to be who I'm going to work with in this battle. Because both of you fail to put implicit trust in Yahweh, in his ability to fight. So how do we develop the spirit of the 300 men? How do we balance these things, brothers and sisters? We see we need to respond in the same way as these do. You see, these men came because they heard their brethren's call for help. Judges chapter 6, verse 34. They're not completely, utterly dismayed. Judges chapter 7, verse 3. But they certainly don't trust in themselves. Judges 7, verse 5. That's how we've got to balance these things, don't we, brothers and sisters? We trust in Yahweh's mighty hand to save and are willing to serve our brethren and willing to risk our lives for that. Not overly self-confident in our own abilities, but trusting that God will be with us as we fight our enemies. So let's try and have the spirit that Paul describes in Philippians chapter 2. Those that examine themselves to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling, because we realize that God works in us to will and to do his good pleasure. And if we truly have the spirit of these 300 men, we might, brothers and sisters and young people, have the privilege and the blessing and the confidence to see just how God's going to work in our lives and in those that are around us to save his people and to bring about his purpose.